Thank you, Ray. I won't be making a presentation. I'll make a few comments. And I brought along a tape that we put together that really Charlie did a couple of years ago, and it goes through the development of our first helicopter, the K-125. And it really is, from the engineering perspective, from those of you, and I see a lot of faces here that spent a lot of time working in that era. The era we're talking about is 45, 46, 47, 48, that time frame. When Charlie got into the helicopter business, and he really does a good job and narrates the tape, and I think it does explain his ideas, the servo flap rotor that he brought to the table to do two things. One, to solve the control loads problem that we talked a little bit about this morning. It also provided a way to solve the blade tracking problem, and it continues to do that today. So command helicopters don't have blade tracking problems. I'll mention Charlie's health. Charlie is his health is a little bit degraded. His mobility is not as good as it used to be. He's still active, and until the last couple of years, really the last year, he was active as an engineer in command. I'm in the engineering department, and I can assure you that he was the chief engineer of Command Aerospace Corporation until about a year ago. And he had played a very, very active day-to-day role in developing the new composite main rotor that we use on our H2 today. And it was on a daily basis at the world stand, looking at the oscillograph rolls, or the computer equivalent of that today. So without any further words from me, if we could roll the tape.
SH-2G helicopters ready for delivery to the Navy, it's a good time to reminisce on the beginning of it all, the original vision, the saga of the K-125, the first helicopter built by then Command Aircraft Corporation. Here's the story. The dream of 1945-46 was that the Command K-125 would be a helicopter that could be flown by anyone, everywhere, and would really darken the skies. Two people in the back, one in the front. The work began on the test rig. Prove the rotor, incorporating our aerodynamic servo flaps, would work. Long, long hours were spent there, and eventually we built the first airframe, K-125. We took it out for its earliest flights in January of 1947. Bitter cold, we were to encounter our first major disappointment. The clutch would not engage. It seemed that the delicate balance between the spring rate and the shoes of the clutch to engage the rotor was just wrong. And as it would come up to speed, it would start chattering, sending enormous torsional vibrations into the blades, and how they held together and didn't break under that punishment was really very surprising. We tried and tried. Finally, on January the 15th, we made two changes in the blizzardy, cold, rain, sleet. Oh, it was bad weather. We had to fly on that day because that was the day the $36,000 provided us by New Enterprises would be gone. and that was to have a first flight. These films show it in the late afternoon of that day, and we almost made flight here, but not quite. Flight occurred 6 inches off the ground against the ropes at dusk, when no longer was there enough light to have a record of it. But we do have a record in the minds of all the people who were there, emblazoned forever. The crew had worked very, very hard. Long hours were almost a starting point. The bitter cold was something you took for granted. But it flew. And it really was a great, great emotional release when that occurred. A few days later, we went outside with Eddie gone on a Sunday morning, pulling down on the tail of the bird every time it would get off the ground. The whole crew were there. We didn't have hard hats or any protective measures. What we would do if something went wrong was not even a consideration. It was not expected, and it did not occur. The first flights in this way, and what followed a few days later, as the snow began to ease off, was the first realization, having fixed the clutch, that our control sensitivity was too great. You see here, when it took off, the pilot was immediately over-controlling. The ship was bouncing around. That was resolved by changing the ratio of the control from the pilot stick to the servo flaps. Meantime, the rotor had been designed to be a single degree of freedom teeter, like a seesaw. But in the presence of a large coning angle, which means a lot of lift, that can give rise to very serious Coriolis forces, which come from acceleration in the plane of rotation. We didn't expect to have coning angles so high, but it didn't appear that they were going to get any less with the configuration that we had. So we resolved to put in a lead lag hinge to relieve the Coriolis forces. That also necessitated a lead lag damper, and that was made by a couple of tubes with brazing brass in between as a friction device. All of this was done in a matter of days, a week or two at the most. And in the resolution of all of this, we were solving major, major problems. We didn't know it then. There was no textbook. There was no guidance. And furthermore, nobody in the world had ever flown a servo-controlled rotor of this configuration. Meanwhile, I had selected an intermeshing configuration in order to save the power that's otherwise wasted in a tail rotor. So even that was new. Although it had been done in Germany during the war, we didn't have access to any of the German data, and we really didn't know what we were getting into until we got there. Flights continued little by little, improvements day by day. And finally, we were ready to venture into a little bit of forward flight as well as hovering. These were very exciting days, and that's the ramp out there by the revetment at Bradley Field, still showing those devices built during the war, World War II, for protection of Bradley Field. The bird was much more stable now. It was really showing its potential as we eased it into forward flight, and suddenly, in addition to hovering, we were flying. Flying with great success. It was clear now that we had the solution. Everyone was thrilled and happy. Watch Schuler dance in the background there. There he goes. After all the effort and the painstaking night and day, suddenly we had reached the point where Jack Rohr, our pilot, was beginning to practice for the big demonstration for new enterprises that was scheduled for Good Friday. Well, in effect, he had to learn to fly this plane. It was unlike any other, and as we would learn with time, much more forgiving, more docile, more stable. But the control forces, just moving the little servo flap, were almost negligible. And it was virtually fingertip control, unheard of at the hour, at the day, at the time. Other helicopters changed their rotor blade pitch at the root and had a horn attached to the control from the pilot that moved the blades. Pilots would virtually get muscle spasms after an hour or so. They were enormously difficult to fly. And those forces were very, very great, to be resolved years later with hydraulic servo. But here the Command K-125 was flying with an aerodynamic servo flap, and it had virtually minimal control forces. No one had ever flown such a plane before. And hence it was necessary for Jack to learn how to fly, which is what he was doing in all of these sequences. In and out of ground effect, sideways, turning, forward, backwards, all of the maneuvers a helicopter is expected to do. When the great day came, said, well, of course, you've flown your principles here, you've demonstrated that, but let's finish the bird. Why don't we make it into a helicopter that you can raise money with? So we went on with this, finishing the bird by degrees. Unfortunately, in our haste to get it done, we abandoned the need and the cost of making tools to make aluminum forms and bulkheads and to have the proper lightweight skin. We made it out of 3/8 of an inch plywood for the bulkheads, and we covered it with plywood also, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, an 1/8 of an inch, that kind. This tended to increase the weight, and that was bad. The weight went way up, much too fast. And by the time we got around to finishing the bird and roll it out as a sparkling red flaming machine, it was pretty badly overweight. So much so that when we flew it in this configuration, we knew that the 125 horsepower four-cylinder engine was not sufficient to do the job. We did prove a lot of things with this. This was about the closest we would get to that original artist version that was shown at the beginning of this film. Having got the rotors tracking, Bill proceeded with the flying, but alas, it was quite clear now that we were simply underpowered. So we took the tail boom off, we took the engine, and we took it out and put in a 6-cylinder Lycoming of 185 horsepower, and suddenly we had enough power. These flights were made to check the drive system. That's why the tail hadn't been added right away. And the drive system was, after all, exhibiting the most singular advantage of the intermeshing helicopter: simplicity. The engine drove directly into the gearbox, a single gearbox, which drove the shafts, which turned the rotors. That principle is even more vivid in its value today than in these early years when the concepts were laid down. Simplicity and reliability cannot be overrated. And the absence of the tail rotor and all of the intermediate gearboxes and the tail rotor components and so on was really an early revelation of how much more efficient would be the intermeshing configuration. It was proven right here in 1947 and in 1948. But we learned something else at that time. The CAB, Civil Aeronautics Board, issued new regulations that would be impossible to fulfill with our meager capital resources. We would have to abandon the concept of the K-125. And in its place would come a special helicopter, a special agricultural plane for dusting, spraying, fogging, and whatever. Because in this manner, the new K-190 would be within our means to certificate with the then CAA under the new CAB rules. So as these flights were winding down, we knew that the K-125 had done its bit. It had proven our principles, and we were very grateful for all that we had learned and the marvelous safety that had been achieved with this early plane. We did go further. We put a single large fin on it, and I undertook to fly. The comic relief of the captions of the day notwithstanding, it was great fun. I didn't even have a pilot's license. I took my hand off the controls to wave. And then, of course, maneuvering, turning, all the rest. It was just great fun. The covering around the nose section had been removed at the time, but it was restored a little later on. And then we had the K-125 and the K-190 flying together. And as the K-125 was winding down its purpose and use, the K-190 would come in and take over. Bill was flying the 190 and I was flying the K-125. We had a fleet of helicopters. By the way, that building back there was the gymnasium, which was our home, 10,000 square feet at Bradley Field. The K-190, K-225 series aircraft became the cornerstone of Command Aircraft's entry into the helicopter industry. Both were certified by the then CAA, today FAA. But the K-125 had a few other tricks up its sleeve. We participated in a movie that was locally done, and we dolled it up again, put on the front frames, painted it up, so that it could participate in that filming. We went on from there to actually put more fins on the back end, as originally contemplated, to explore stability and control, and it's shown here in that configuration. I was flying it again, and this is sort of the wind-up before its final return. So looking back, we had a concept, we had a dream, we had an ambition. And we proceeded to try to make it happen. Life can be cruel for reasons beyond our control, the CAV. That was not attainable. We had to divert our energies in other directions. But the triumph of success does not go away. And the success that is achieved through extreme efforts is with you for the rest of your life. Confidence that this early work gave us in ourselves in the absence of any precedent whatsoever that we could call upon was truly one of the greatest confidence builders one could ever expect. It was a joy, it was a privilege, it was an extreme exertion to show what man can do. It meant the safety of the company, it meant the safety of all the people, it meant Command Aircraft would go forward in its role in helicopters in the United States. And with a heroic start, such as the K-125, indeed, Command did go forward and play a role in the development of the helicopter industry in America. We built helicopters for the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, the Navy again, and played a principal role in the development of technology and rotary wing aircraft. Today, after nearly 50 years, we are able to call on that technology to take us into the 21st century with a new vision.
The doors open at dawn, and as they step into the morning light, these test pilots know they know they're a breed apart, and so is their aircraft. They know they are the best in the world at what they do, and they have the confidence their aircraft will perform that same way. Here at Command, we build helicopters for them.
Mike said that's not.
The last guy, Charlie, in addition to being an engineer and a businessman, is a salesman, and the last part of the tape is a little bit salesy, so we can cut it off. If anybody wants to see it, we could perhaps show it later. But thanks for your attention.
I think you're getting the idea that developing a helicopter but it's fun, as Charlie Command said. Our we have a disc up here in the machine. Are you going to make the presentation?
Good afternoon. Мое имя Сергей Михеев. Я президент фирмы «Камов», российской фирмы «Камов». И нахожусь на своем посту с 1973 года, практически сразу же после смерти Николая Ильича Камова.
My name is Sergei Mikheyev. I am the head of a Russian helicopter company, Kamov Company. I took this position in 1973, right after Nikolai Kamov passed away.
В этом году исполняется 100 лет со дня рождения Николая Камова, безусловно, выдающегося человека, который всю свою жизнь был увлечен идеей полета с использованием ротора, несущего винта.
This year we will be celebrating the centennial anniversary of Nikolai Kamov, a really outstanding personality who devoted all his life to the idea of a rotorcraft, an aircraft with a rotor.
Это был инженер, который оставил в памяти потомков свое имя как создатель реального серийного вертолета соосной схемы, идея которого уже известна более 250 лет.
Nikolai Kamov was an engineer whose name remained in the aviation history as the name of the designer who brought to life a real large-scale coaxial helicopter, which idea was known for more than 250 years.
Свою деятельность Николай Камов начал в 1929 году с создания автожира. Здесь на верхнем фото слева помещен, показан, сфотографирован он сам и его помощники, пилоты и механики.
Kamov started his engineering career in 1929 by designing an autogyro. On this picture, on the upper picture to the left, you see Kamov himself and with his assistants, a pilot and a mechanic.
10 лет были отданы созданию автожиров различных конструкций, но главным за этот период надо считать практическую работу над конструкцией лопасти ротора с остальным несущим лонжероном.
10 years Kamov devoted to autogyros of various configurations, but his main activity during this period was a practical work on designing a rotor blade structure with a steel tubular spar.
В конце 30-х годов завершен полный цикл испытаний и рекомендован в серийное производство автожир А7, который имел как военное, так и гражданское назначение.
At the end of the 30s, A7 autogyro has completed a full cycle of tests and was recommended for serious production as a military and civil operations.
Сейчас в том месте, где находится главный офис фирмы, в 1940 году правительство Советского Союза принимает решение на одном из подмосковных аэродромов делать завод винтокрылых летательных аппаратов.
In 1940, the government of the Soviet Union took a decision to establish a first Rotorcraft production plant. It was located on the airfield where now the headquarters of Kamov company are.
Директором завода был назначен Камов, главным инженером Михаил Миль, выдающийся руководитель одного из самостоятельных конструкторских бюро в дальнейшем.
Kamov was appointed the director of the plant, and Mikhail Mil was appointed chief engineer. Later, this outstanding designer became the leader of another standalone helicopter company.
В послевоенные годы, в тяжелые годы нашей страны, Камов строит небольшой вертолет Камов-8 с двигателем от немецкого мотоцикла «Харлей» и демонстрирует его на воздушном параде 1948 года перед правительством и перед Сталиным.
After the war, the period which was very hard for our country, Kamov built the first light helicopter Kamov or Ka-8, which was demonstrated during the air parade in 1948 in front of Stalin.
Эта демонстрация первого вертолета соосной схемы фирмы Камова и стала поводом для создания нового конструкторского бюро в 1949 году.
This successful demonstration laid the basis for establishing a design bureau for coaxial helicopters in 1949.
Спроектированный инициативой. Это маленькая машина, названная своими создателями К-8 «Иркутяне», отличалась рядом оригинальных конструкторских решений. Главным из них было использование соосной схемы несущих винтов, что позволило отказаться от установки на вертолет рулевого винта, тем самым значительно уменьшив габариты аппарата и использовать всю мощность двигателя на привод несущих винтов. К-8 мог взлетать прямо из кузова грузовой автомашины и садиться туда-обратно. Демонстрация этого вертолета на параде произвела большое впечатление на представителей командования военно-морского флота. На базе первенца К-8 «Иркутянин» был
Все, следующий. Одним из выдающихся достижений Николая Ильича Камова было создание комбинированного летательного аппарата, сочетающего в себе достоинства вертолета и самолета.
One of the greatest achievements of Kamov was the development of a compound aircraft combining the advantages of a helicopter and a fixed-wing aircraft.
Камов дал ему новое название такому типу летательного аппарата «винтокрыл».
Kamov gave a new name, a new term to this type of aircraft, винтокрыл.
Эта конструкция во многом опередила свое время.
In many ways, this design was ahead of its time.
Достаточно сказать, что взлетный вес этого летательного аппарата был 36 тонн.
It's enough to mention that the takeoff weight of this aircraft was 36 tons,
Полезная нагрузка 5 тонн.
payload 5 tons,
Скорость полета, показанная в 1962 году, 360 км в час.
and flight speed achieved in 1962, 360 kilometers per hour.
Впервые были отработаны агрегаты, которые подвергались исключительным нагрузкам.
For the first time, the elements, the components which had the most load-carrying components were tested,
Новая система управления
a new control system,
и так далее.
and others.
Однако многие материалы, которые располагал конструктор, конечно, не предполагались нести те нагрузки, с которыми пришлось столкнуться.
But many structural materials which were at the disposal of a designer were not intended for carrying such high loads.
Удивительно, но лопасть диаметром 22 метра была изготовлена из древесины.
It's surprising, but the blade with a diameter of 20 meters was made of wood.
И в отдельных режимах полета скорость на конце лопасти достигала 1 маха.
And on some regimes, the tip speed reached 1 Mach.
Николай Камов умер в ноябре 1973 года.
Nikolai Kamov died in November 1973.
А в июне 1973 года
And in July of the same year,
на аэр-шоу в Париже
during the aviation show in Paris,
была сделана вот эта фотография.
this photo was taken.
На фоне вертолета К-26 вы видите молодого Сергея Сикорского
Near Kamov Ka-26 helicopter, you can see young Sergei Sikorsky
и молодого Сергея Михеева.
and young Sergei Mikheyev.
Из этого исторического документа видно, что прическа а-ля Сикорский была у него еще 30 лет назад.
And this historic document shows that this headdress a la Sikorsky he had even 30 years ago.
Почти 30 лет нет с нами Николая Камова.
Nearly 30 years have passed since Nikolai Kamov passed away.
Но дело его живет,
But his ideas continue to live,
и люди его коллектива продолжают нести обществу и всей цивилизации все новые и новые идеи, новые машины.
and the people of his team continue to bring new ideas and continue to design new helicopters for the world community and civilization.
Следующий. Следующий. Thank you very much. И в завершении от коллектива наших участников этого 58-го форума Американского вертолетного общества я хотел бы преподнести офису вертолетного общества вот эти две книги «История фирмы Камов за 50 лет».
And in conclusion, on behalf of Kamov delegation here at the 58th Forum of the American Helicopter Society, I want to present two books to the Office of the American Helicopter Society, two books which contain the history, the 50-year history of Kamov Company.
Спасибо.
Очень спасибо. That's my Russian. These go into the AHS library, which those of you who have visited the headquarters in Alexandria maybe know that there is a library in the basement, but it needs some attention. These, I hope, will get filed in the right place. In order to keep things going at the right speed here, I want to ask Miller Wachs to do his presentation at this point. Miller? And after this, we'll have the mill presentation.
The helicopter bug attacked me before there was any such thing as a flying vehicle, as a successful helicopter. It was during my junior year getting a BS in physics that the bug hit. That was in 1934 and 32 and 3. After the bug hit, I more or less followed Sikorsky as a young man in thinking of terms of the configuration of coaxial two rotors rotating in opposite direction, thus solving the anti-torque problem. And made some models and made some tests with it. During my I decided that if I was going to really play a part in bringing helicopters into being, that I should go on with a master's degree at MIT, which involved first getting the basic undergraduate engineering type courses first, so it took a space of 2 years to do it. In thinking of the helicopter, independently of the basic invention that was made quite some years ago, as revealed in the Very Flight magazine, the azimuth control principle. It was original with us, my father and myself, as being the way to conquer most historical attempts at helicopters showed that the control of the helicopter and making it go where you want to go was a difficult problem. And it seemed to me that this azimuth control idea would be the way to go. During my second year at MIT, one of our engineers that was graduating that same year fortunately had a car, and there was 2 aero companies operating in Buffalo at that time, and the 3 of us went there applying for jobs at graduation time. About May, sometime in May, Curtis Wright Company in Buffalo tempted me to come work in the shop first before graduating to working in the engineering department. And in those deep depression years of 1935, it was a great temptation to give up the idea of completing the degree and taking the proposition by Curtis Wright. And it took a bit of courage to grit my teeth and say, no, I got to finish the job I'm doing right now. Incidentally, Igor Sikorsky came to our small aero group at MIT and gave a lecture, and he was looking forward to building even bigger flying boats than had been exploring all the routes in the Caribbean, South America, and even as far away as Australia and China. The point of it was that I had to continue to, and in the process of graduating, I did apply to Sikorsky because I knew as a young man that he had made an attempt at helicopters. And in those deep depression days, there was no reply to that request. I did something that I say even was pretty smart. I thought that maybe the engineering going into the controllable pitch propellers that were being of 3 types at that time would be the engineering aspects that could be applied to a helicopter. And so I wrote to all 3 of these companies and asked them if they had any cutaway of their device or any papers they had issued and so on, and they gave me some data. And I wrote my own course of applying the engineering aspects of designing controlled pitch propellers and asked them for any things that I might be able to put in the appendix of this paper, and made enough copies to send to all 3 of these companies. And somehow, I don't know where it came from, I had a quiet confidence at graduation time that things would work out. But just before that, during the week between the last exams and the actual graduation, I decided to make a dash trip by bus down to Philadelphia, which was the rotary wing capital in America at that time, with about 4 companies. And I made myself known to them and made applications to all of them. And none of the 4 had an offer of a job, except that one of the fellows said, first of all, become a good draftsman, but not too good. And that was good advice. So here I was, graduated, and fortunately one of those 3 companies offered me a job at Lycoming Motors, which is associated with, and they did a nice job for us in the fact that I thought anybody designing gadgets that pilots had to go off with some risk to their life and do the experimental flying. I thought that a person should have the feel or understand the feel of pilots that do this. And Lycoming wanted to get into the light plane engine business, and they decided after they certified their engine and everything that they'd conduct a sales tour of the whole United States with 3 models of light planes installed with the Lycoming engines. And when they had completed this tour, they decided to sell 2 of those planes, but kept 1 and made it available to employees to learn to fly. And I responded to that because all we had to pay was for gasoline and oil and the instructor. And the company hangared the airplane, kept the engines, of course, in high tune, And so after that, after we got certified, and at that time, you had to demonstrate that you could stall the plane into a spin and get out of that spin. You had, in getting your certificate, that was a requirement at the time. And the only time was that one time that I actually did this to demonstrate to FAA that I could do it, get it out of the spin. Anyway, here I was, eager to make the helicopter happen, and no job. But one of these 3 companies responded and hired me for 5.5 years at Lycoming. Incidentally, doing that, maybe I mentioned that I applied to Sikorsky because I knew that as a young man he had tried helicopters and thought he might go back to that idea. And Sikorsky had no job at that time. And then about 3 years later, the advanced work on the VS-300 was coming to light in the Aero magazines, and I needed to go up and see my sister married in Boston, and on the way I could stop in Stratford, and so I applied again the second time. Well, by that time I was in a family away with 1 daughter, and I left the wife and daughter out in the parking lot, reported for this interview. And I read all the magazines in the waiting room, and then finally went back, and the receptionist got all flustered because she hadn't taken care of me yet. Well, soon a man came down, and I said, I'm not the least bit interested in Frozen Wing, which was pouring out of the new factory where United Aircraft had shoved Chance Vought out of Hartford into Stratford, and it was called Vought-Sikorsky. And this man's reaction was, we don't know whether it's going to ever amount to anything, and there's only a very few people working on this helicopter. So, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles, and I said, glad to meet you, goodbye. And then somebody else came down. At that time, it was called Vought-Sikorsky. And another man came down, one of the glue refs, and I said, well, I'm glad to meet you, and I've had my interview, goodbye. Well, I was telling a former colleague of mine that worked at Lycoming, he says, oh, yes, that was a marriage that was never consummated, Vought-Sikorsky. There was 2 companies in the same plant, and they hardly spoke to each other, actually. So I must have been talking to a Vought guy, because he had absolutely no prospect of helicopters ever coming into existence. And so that was the second interview. The third interview was, third application was right after Pearl Harbor. And by that time, I owned 1/6 of this light plane, had to leave that behind. But Sikorsky accepted me the third time and in. Sikorsky had finished up all this nonsense of extra rotors on the VS-300 and went back to the original configuration. A single main rotor, cyclically controlled, and an anti-torque tail rotor. The R4 had been almost ready to fly, had just been barely finished, and I jokingly say they must have sawed off the extra beams and so on for the extra rotors, because they were anticipating doing something of that sort with the R4 all over again. Well, they did not. And it was very shortly after that I got there as the 13th engineer to work completely on the helicopters. And during my 32 years, the engineering department grew to something like 1,500 engineers. And it's been a very satisfying experience in this 32 years. We went through, as we got bigger and bigger helicopters, 3 different configuration of clutches, and there are a lot of detailed stories that I could tell you, but I will not bore you with that. My chief part of my time at Sikorsky was as chief development engineer on all of, mostly a mechanical type engineer, and the helicopter is very mechanical. So I had many times chance to improve helicopters to make them last longer and be better maintained, more maintainable and reliable. And it has been a very, very satisfactory experience for me. Thank you.
I think you can say that not only persistence pays off in developing a helicopter, but persistence pays off in getting a job in the helicopter industry, too. We have quite a contingent from Mil today. Marat Tashenko is going to introduce our distinguished guests, and then there'll be a video on the Mil developments.
Ladies and gentlemen, at first I want to say thank you to person who decide arrange this meeting. Second, I want to say thank you to headquarters of American Helicopter Society, which organized this meeting. And third, I want to say thank you, Professor Proti, who spent so effort and time for this meeting. Unfortunately, my English is not so good, and I ask help me professional translator, Andrei.
I'm an engineer. I'm not a professional translator, but I hope my English will be more or less understandable.
В развитии любого вида техники сейчас главную роль играют коллективы, создающие эту технику.
Human factor is becoming more and more important in any brand of industry. Helicopter industry is included.
Однако главную роль играет руководитель.
However, the manager, the top person of a company is of major importance.
Поэтому сегодня, когда мы говорим об истории американского вертолетостроения, мы вспоминаем Сикорского, Песецкого, Камана, Раймонда Янга и других пионеров американского вертолетостроения.
Now, when we are speaking about the history of American helicopter industry, we remember such names as Sikorsky, Piasecki, Raymond Young, Kaman, and other pioneers of Sikorsky helicopter industry.
Именно поэтому мой коллега Сергей Михеев говорил о Николае Ильиче Камове.
Therefore, my colleague, Dr. Sergei Mikheyev, spoke about their founder, Dr. Kamov.
И мы начинаем свое выступление с добрых слов, посвященных Михаилу Леонидовичу Милю, организатору нашего конструкторского бюро.
And we are starting our presentation with the good works, good commemoration of our founder, Dr. Mill.
Именно его энергия, целеустремленность и преданность вертолетам позволила создать уникальный коллектив, который создал хорошо известные вертолеты марки Ми.
He was very devoted to this field of industry, and his energy enabled to create such a group of engineers, such a collective, which are now responsible for all the helicopters of Mill series.
Я рад представить почтенному собранию ближайших коллег доктора Миля и ветеранов конструкторского бюро.
I am glad to present to the respectable audience the closest friends and colleagues of Dr. Mill and veterans of Mill Company.
Здесь присутствует доктор Браверман, который является практически с самого начала существования фирмы с 1948 года руководителем работ по аэродинамике.
And now in the audience we have Dr. Braverman, who works at Mill since 1948, and he's a leader in aerodynamics at Mill.
Я хочу представить Бориса Сиротинского, который работает на фирме с 1951 года и руководит отделом проектирования лопастей.
Mr. Boris Sirotinsky works at Mill since 1951, and he is responsible for Mill blade department.
Я хочу представить Евгения Яблонского, который работает на фирме Миля с 1953 года и сейчас руководит проектированием систем вооружения для вертолетов.
Mr. Eugene Yablonsky works at Mill since 1953, and now his responsibility is weapon system integration.
Я хочу представить вам уникального летчика, который сейчас, несмотря на то, что ему уже 87 лет, работает в конструкторском бюро Миля. Это Федор Прокопенко.
Let me introduce to you a unique test pilot of the helicopters, Mr. Fyodor Prokopenko. He is 87 now, but he is still working at Mill.
Прокопенко имеет уникальную биографию.
He has a unique background.
Он начал летать в 1935 году.
He started to fly in 1935
как пилот планера.
as a pilot of a glider.
Затем он был летчиком-истребителем.
Then he was a fighter pilot.
Он начал военные действия на третий день Второй мировой войны.
He was in the battle actions on the third day of the World War II.
Он участвовал в обороне Севастополя, а потом Сталинграда.
He took part in the defense operations near Sevastopol, that's a Russian city name, near Stalingrad, this name you know better, we believe.
Он сбил 16 вражеских самолетов.
He shot down 16 Nazi airplanes.
Он был в воздушном бою, его самолет был поврежден, и ему пришлось совершать вынужденную посадку на лес.
His airplane was damaged, and he had a forced landing on the woods.
После этого он вылечился и с некоторыми ограничениями продолжал летать.
After he had badly wounded, and after recovery, he was still allowed to fly with some limitations.
В 50-м году он был назначен заместителем командира подразделения, в которое пришли первые серийные вертолеты Ми.
In 1950, he was a deputy of a group which received the first serial production helicopters of MIL. They were MIL-1s.
Он летал на самых разных вертолетах, и фирмы Миля, и фирмы Камова, до 1976 года.
He was flying at different types of helicopters, both MIL and Kamov companies, till 1976.
И он закончил свой путь в должности командира армейской авиации.
And his last position was the commander of Army Aviation of Russia.
Of Soviet Union.
Of Soviet Union, sorry.
Мы подготовили некоторый исторический фильм.
We have prepared some historical movie,
который, может быть, не очень вписывается в линию сегодняшнего совещания, но я надеюсь, что совещание нас простит.
It may not fit absolutely to the kind of presentations which we have now today. It's less historical than the others, but we believe it will be of interest to the audience.
В заключение моего выступления я хочу передать профессору Проути, который здесь представляет руководство американского вертолетного общества, несколько сувениров.
To conclude my presentation, I would like to present and to give to Professor Prouty few souvenirs we brought with us.
Это портрет доктора Милля.
This is a photo picture of Dr. Mill.
This is for American Helicopter Society gift from Mill Design Bureau.
Спасибо. Очень спасибо.
Don't mention. Следующее – это модель вертолета Ми-26, который, я думаю, не нуждается в специальных комментариях. Модель специально сделана очень маленькой, чтобы подчеркнуть, что на самом деле вертолет самый большой в мире.
This is the model of Mi-26 helicopter. It is the model is intentionally small to underline that the helicopter is the biggest in the world, biggest production. It's really huge.
И это история нашего конструкторского.
And this is the book for the library, your library.
yes.
That's the history of Mill Design Bureau.
Thank you very much for attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're happy to take you with us on a short helicopter video journey, a kind of whirlwind round-the-world trip in time and space. In some 15 minutes, we'll cover a distance of more than 15,000 kilometers, with short stops in 10 out of the 80 countries that are marked on the map with small circles. This is where helicopters of the popular Mi class work or used to work. We thought it natural to begin the journey precisely from Moscow, since the capital of Russia is the center of helicopter building in this country. In particular, this is the site of the world-famous experimental design bureau of the Moscow helicopter plant named after Mil, the founder of this firm. Choppers designed by the bureau have been named me in his honor, while the plant itself, thanks to journalists, has been dubbed Mil's firm. Moscow in the second half of the 60s. This is the famous designer Mikhail Mil. Documentary shots, Mil with his colleagues and pupils. Engineer Marat Tishenko was young at the time. He will replace famous Mil as chief designer in 1969. Next to Mil is Mark Weinberg, who in March of 1992 is to become the third chief designer of that firm. Let's listen to what he has to say in 1993. What is our firm today? It turns out 95% of all the helicopters that are made in our country, they bear the Me trademark. It has built 25,000 helicopters, 15,000 of which are flying today. It accounts for at least 1/3 of the hard currency Russia receives from the export of its aircraft. The Moscow countryside in 1993, the most powerful gunship in the world, Mi-28 is in the air. Until his latest appointment, Weinberg was the leader of that program. Both the amazing possibilities of the chopper, as well as the creative possibilities of its designers, are on display. The machine develops an overload of up to 3 Gs. The craft has been put into serial production. One more Mi is up in the air. The new 4-seater Mi-34. It too can develop an overload of 3 Gs. All possible and impossible figures of aerobatics are executed. The Mi-34 is a helicopter for world champions, and at the same time, it's an economic flying jeep. Its hourly consumption of fuel is a mere 45 kilograms. The first serial samples have already come off the line. Its takeoff weight is approximately 1 ton. This is the lightest helicopter of the Mil firm. And this is the Mi-12, the heaviest and grandest of all helicopters ever built by anyone. Paris, 1969, the Mi-12 at La Bourget. Its world records have yet to be eclipsed by anyone. Payload 40 tons, takeoff weight 105 tons, an altitude of 2,000 meters. Papua New Guinea at the beginning of the 1990s. Russian helicopter leasing operations are carried out on a broad scale. Among them is the Mi-26, the biggest chopper ever to be used for commercial purposes. Its bay can accommodate up to 20 tons of cargo and transport it up to 600 kilometers, and a cargo of 15 tons for a distance of up to 800 kilometers. Sweden, 1993. The crew of another Mi-26 faces the difficult job of building a 40-kilometer long high-power transmission line in 10 working days. 144 pylons as high as a 10 or 12-story building must be installed in ready-made nests about 1 meter in diameter. The diameter of the butt of the pylon is 800 millimeters. The clearance between the pylon and the edge of the nest, which must not be damaged, is minimal. But even that is not the main difficulty. The system of external suspension, together with a 32-meter-long pylon, forms a 2-stage pendulum of great length, up to 50 meters. And it's very heavy, up to 20 tons, which in itself required a solution of serious problems in the field of dynamics. However, this highly complicated task is solved and work continues successfully. The heavy helicopters Mi-26 and Mi-10K have been working in Sweden on construction and installation projects since 1990. In 1993, the Mi-26 participated in the construction of the biggest bridge in Europe by placing structures weighing up to 22 tons each. Western Europe at the end of the 60s. The heavy helicopters Mi-6 and Mi-10K demonstrate their flying technical and commercial possibilities in the countries of that region. Excerpts from newsreels of that time. The Mi-6 in the Austrian Alps. In Switzerland over Bern. In Norway. France from 1990 to 1992. Here, with the help of the Mi-26 and the Mi-17, a whole number of leasing operations were carried out in the transportation of mining equipment, road building equipment, bulldozers and such, as well as lifting out high-quality timber from the mountains. The Mi-26 in the Pyrenees, and the Mi-17 in the Alps. The French remembered most likely the group jump of parachutists in Vichy and Rion de Chateau near Paris during the annual international competitions. Up to 135 sportsmen were in the air simultaneously aboard the Mi-26. One might ask how this came about. After all, Russian helicopters have no Western certificates. By the way, neither do American or French helicopters have Russian certificates. Nevertheless, jet rangers worked above Moscow and gazelles over Russia along the route of the Paris-Moscow-Beijing auto rally. Life itself seems to suggest that national flying personnel depart from their old dogmas and make exclusions to the rules. A whole number of Western countries, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Cyprus, gave permission to carry out commercial operations employing Mi helicopters, since in practice they won the international guarantee of reliability. Sakhalin in the 1970s, an island that is washed in the south by the Sea of Japan. The Mi-8 working on the construction of high-power transmission lines. It's noteworthy that Japan's Air Register was the first to issue a certificate to such a chopper purchased by a Japanese company meeting American standards. India from the 60s to the 90s. Military and civilian versions of Mi's made up more than half the helicopter pool of that big country. It was only in 1993 when it first became necessary that India's Avia Register issued a certificate for the passenger type Mi-172, also on the basis of American standards. Afghanistan in the period from the 70s to the 80s. No doubt, military specialists are well aware of the Afghan effect from the extensive use of Mi gunships. The limited contingent of troops, thanks to the use of helicopters, in spite of unending attacks by a greatly superior enemy, in the course of 8 years, controlled all the important centers, territories, and transportation arteries of that mountain country. Invaluable aid for United Nations troops being used in hotspots around the world. The Caucasus, now the territories of new states in the 80s. Here, complicated construction of high-power transmission lines in the mountains became possible only thanks to the use of the flying crane, the Mi-10K. The Pamirs, the roof of the world, now also the territories of new countries in the 70s and 80s. Mi helicopters here became one of the main and sometimes only passenger delivery service. The Mi-8 is the helicopter most often used here. Russia, the 70s and 80s and the beginning of the 90s. The main forces of the Mi helicopter fleet are, of course, in this country, but they are spread out all over the regions. A substantial part of the craft are working in the most remote areas with severe northern climates, but unusually rich with oil, gold, diamonds, and other minerals. For instance, in Kamchatka, Siberia, and others. Besides the conventional, the state system of monitoring the technical state of helicopters in Russia includes the so-called author's inspection on the part of the designing firm, in the given case, the mill firm. Any easing of the author's inspection can lead to higher accident rates. Meanwhile, Some 6,000 Me helicopters are now flying outside Russia. Mil specialists know nothing about the technical state of many of them. In the main, this concerns those machines that were bought on the black market at dumping prices. Observing all regulations, Me choppers are absolutely reliable even in conditions where Western analogs have not been designed for operating. However, this is not so easy to achieve, and it is not cheap. The Mil plant near Moscow, 1992, Dynamic Testing Laboratory. It was here that authoritative representatives from the United States Federation Aviation Agency carried out a painstaking study of the reliability of the Me-26, of which there are no analogs in the world, and noted that the dynamic tests of the helicopter structures, as well as tests for repeated static gliding of the Me helicopters, are much more stringent than at American companies. Once again in Moscow in the 90s, the Me-10K and the Me-26 on a construction project right over the city. Is this not an indication of complete trust in its reliability on the part of the Air Register? In 1991, representatives of the U.S. Federal Aviation Agency and Russia's Air Register signed a protocol which, among other things, declares the Rotorcraft Directorate is now in a position to inform the FAA on the suitability of the new model Me-26T type design for external load operations. Ukraine, 1986. Me helicopters mopping up the consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. A few words about their strategic reliability. Several years after that event, a major physicist evaluating the role they played said, "You want to build an atomic power station? Then tell me what kind of helicopters you have, and I'll tell you whether it's worth doing it." Our Me-26 helicopter over the waters of the North Sea belonging to the Netherlands. It was the first Western country that purchased the Me-8 and Me-10 back in 1965. Later, they were resold to the Petroleum Helicopter Company of the United States. The helicopter hovers over one of the many oil drilling platforms here. Businessmen and journalists are on board. They're discussing a major project involving the use of giant helicopters. However, that's already another story, all the more so since it's shrouded in a veil of confidentiality. The expedition returns to the shore. And our journey is coming to an end. Our craft is coming down for a landing. We complete our round-the-world trip in Holland. We do hope that you found it interesting, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Marat, and our Russian friends. We have a coffee break scheduled at 3 o'clock, so we've got time for at least a couple in here. So, John Piasecki, are you ready? John is, of course, standing in for his father, Frank.
I don't know if this is meeting we were out. I'm going to say a few words, but just make sure it's Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Piasecki, and I'm representing my dad, Frank, who sends his regards. apologizes for not being here. He had a stroke a few years ago, so traveling for him is difficult. But he's still coming to work almost every day, and he's still kicking my rear end from one side of the office to the other, so he's doing pretty well. My brother Fred and I are working with him on helicopter research. I've got a tape here today that... Okay. Got a tape here today that covers some of the history of his achievements. But before I play that tape, I did want to make some comments from my perspective as his son. And somebody who's witnessed a lot of people and efforts that he and his gang worked over the years, and I just wanted to relate some of my perspectives. First of all, the age of a lot of the people at this time doing helicopter development was incredibly young. My dad was 24 when he and his fellow students from the University of Pennsylvania achieved their first flight in the PV-2. And I think it's a real testimony to their accomplishments that they did it at such a young age. The other thing is that one of the points that he's made to me over the years, it's not one person who creates an invention. Every person builds on the knowledge and the failures of the people before him. I remember we were at some reception, and somebody came up to my dad and said, Frank Piasecki, nice to meet you. You're a real pioneer in the industry and what have you. And Dad said, thank you very much. And when he walked away, he leaned over to me and said, John, you know how you can tell who the pioneers are? They're the ones with the arrows in their ass. So he understood that the achievements that we all are admiring today are the products of lots of people's work. In particular, with respect to his activities, Elliot Daland was probably the most important influence in his technical career, and other people like Don Myers and Ken Meenan helped him design and then build these aircraft you'll see today. The other thing that I think is pretty interesting in seeing all the work that everybody is presenting today is the vision that was required by these people. With respect to the achievements of the Piasecki crew, the PV-2, which was the second successful helicopter in the United States, the technical achievement of dynamically balancing the rotor blades was probably the most important achievement there. And then the vision to be able to think big and think large about what helicopters could do, which led to the development of the tandem helicopter, which had a capability of about 3 times the size of any other helicopters at the time. Which really led to the practical application of helicopters with the Navy, which had that requirement for 1,800 pounds useful load before they would really consider these novel machines. The next element that I want to pay tribute to is the courage that these young developers had. I was talking to a gentleman by the name of George Brooks. I don't know if he's still here. Yeah, here he's right down there. And he was talking to me about doing a dynamic analysis on the H-25, the HUP. And we made the joke that in those days you built the helicopters and then you analyzed them afterwards, as opposed to today when we analyze and then build. So in many cases these people were flying machines that had no certainty of them being successful. So I think that took a lot of courage, and it's a real tribute to their success. And then the final, probably the most important element of all of the characteristics that I've noticed in all the presentations today is persistence. Especially when you're doing things that don't easily lend themselves to analysis or prediction, having the persistence to continue time and time again in the face of failure to go until you can achieve your objectives is an admirable attribute. Without further ado, then I will let this video be played, and thank you all very much, and congratulations to all the many pioneers that are being paid tribute to here today.
Thank you, John. says.
The Boeing VTOL Chinook, the Western world's standard medium-lift helicopter for almost 30 years. Immediately recognizable with its two rotors, one in front and one at the rear. The classic tandem arrangement. The world's first helicopter designed specifically for lift was also a tandem rotor design. The forefather of the Chinook, the Piasecki HRP-1, was better known as the Flying Banana. The prototype first flew in 1947 in Philadelphia, the home of helicopter pioneer Frank Piasecki.
Philadelphia was sort of a center of rotary wing activity. And it was mainly because the Pitcairn family, Harold Pitcairn in particular, brought the Sierra patents from the British Sierra Company to the U.S. and set up a company in Willow Grove to manufacture autogyros.
For a young engineer, 1930s Philadelphia was an exciting town. Other rotorcraft manufacturers had followed Pitcairn's lead and set up factories there. Frank Piasecki took a ride in an autogyro and was hooked. He graduated in aeronautical engineering and went to work at the Platt-LePage Aircraft Corporation, manufacturers of the XR-1, America's first military helicopter. But Frank wasn't fulfilled by his job at Platt-LePage. With a group of young engineers, he built his own helicopter, the PV-2. By April 1943, the aircraft was ready to fly.
But there were very few experienced pilots. There were about 7 people, Lou Levitt being one of them, amongst them. And he wasn't available. And so when we thought it over, including the prices, we decided it was me who was going to be the pilot.
As a pilot, Frank Piasecki only had 14 hours of fixed-wing flying time. He had to teach himself to fly the PV-2. Frank was the son of Polish immigrants. When the day of the first flight came, he used the only available open space, the local Polish picnic ground. In spite of some tricky moments, the first flights were encouraging enough to warrant the PV-2 being fitted with a complete skin. In its new streamlined form, it was rolled out for a continuing series of test flights. The PV-2, with its dynamically balanced rotor blades and full cyclic pitch control, was seen by Piasecki as a technology demonstrator. As the designer and the pilot, he was in a perfect position to get it right.
And it was a sweetheart. It could do anything. It was very controllable machine.
The PV-2 was only the second American helicopter to be demonstrated in public, but Frank Piasecki had another audience in mind. He showed the PV-2 to the Navy and tried to interest them in a large transport helicopter. He had some definite ideas about a new approach.
We said we would be absolutely honest to ourselves as to the estimates of weight, structural strength, and all of the things required, so that we wouldn't come out with an absolute answer, but we would come out with a relative answer to each of the designs. And the tandem, no matter how we did it, no matter who did it in this comparison and calculations, the tandem always came out better. And the reason for it became fairly obvious. One, all of your power is going into lift because the rotor, the counteracting the torque was automatic by the fact that the two rotors turn in opposite directions. So that was fundamental.
But the Navy wasn't interested, and Piasecki took the idea to the Coast Guard. On New Year's Day 1944, he signed a contract with the Coast Guard to build an experimental helicopter. The first Piasecki tandem helicopter had the designation XHRPX, but to the Piasecki Company, it was known as the Dog Ship. The rotors of the dog ship had a diameter of 41 feet, and the fuselage was 48 feet long. It was designed to cruise at almost 100 miles an hour and to carry a load that was unheard of for helicopters.
So our effective useful load of 1,900 pounds in those days was roughly 3 times the size of anything that was flying at that time.
At the time, the dog ship was the world's largest helicopter. It could carry 2 crew and 10 passengers. It was powered by one Continental R975 engine, developing 450 horsepower. That engine drove both sets of rotors. Weight was crucial, and when the dog ship finally got a skin, it was made from the lightest available material, balloon cloth. The dog ship was not a prototype. It was seen as a flying mock-up. This way it was possible to measure its flight and control characteristics, with a view to improving them when the prototype was built. The dog ship could also be used for demonstration to prospective buyers. The Navy was now convinced, and it ordered 2 prototypes, designated HRP-1, for further testing. They had Pratt & Whitney R1340 radial engines of 600 horsepower. Like the dog ship, the prototype HRP-1s flew without a skin, and their performance was impressive enough for the Navy to place an order in June 1946 for 10 production models. Later, they ordered another 10. When the HRP-1 went into service in June 1947, the bent fuselage shape immediately created interest. From then on, it was stuck with the name Flying Banana.
People didn't realize why that shape was, but it was because you had to have clearance in the middle of the fuselage for the rotor blade flapping. And of course, as you flew forward and you tilted the machine, the front part of the machine was level and the rear part was up as a rear pylon.
The skeptics had said that tandem rotor design would never work, but it did. In 1945, the U.S. Navy issued requirements for a compact utility and rescue helicopter to operate at sea. This Piasecki design, the HUP-1, made its first flight in October 1948. It won the naval competition against a Sikorsky single rotor design and went into service in 1949. The overlapping rotors gave it an advantage in the cramped space of small aircraft carriers.
This made it possible for the design to be brought up into the carrier elevator, the rear rotor unlocked and phased properly so that its blades were in the proper corners and the front rotor in the proper corners, and then dropped immediately without any folding of the blades, which made a tremendous time advantage to the overlap tandem.
But the overlapping rotors produced more downwash than single rotor helicopters.
Because the downwash of one rotor added to the downwash of the other. So you had a bigger downwash in the center, but we had enough blade area and enough power, and we were so much more efficient than the single rotor that didn't really bother us.
339 Piasecki HUP helicopters were built, and they gave 20 years of service to military forces in the U.S., Canada, and France. The HRP-2 was an improved version of the original HRP-1 Flying Banana. The pilot now sat forward of the front rotor, and the helicopter was given a metal skin. Its successor, the H-21 Workhorse, was designed at the height of the Cold War as a high-altitude rescue helicopter, able to pick up returning bomber crews if they went down to the mountains of Alaska. It was a challenge to any new pilot.
We found that when the pilot made a hovering turn, he made it about himself. and he became the center of the turn, and the rest of the machine went all around him. You could, if you force yourself as a pilot, rotate the machine exactly on its center of gravity, but that meant that you were flying sideways with the tip of the machine, with the end of the machine, and so you were going laterally and around in a circle yourself, which wasn't exactly what a pilot likes to do.
The workhorse was given a larger engine and rotor system to cope with the possibility of rescues at high altitude. Two massive drive shafts connected the 1,425 horsepower engine to the front and rear rotors. The rotor diameter was now 44 feet, and drive shaft maintenance was crucial to the safety of these large tandem helicopters. The H-21 lived up to its name. It was a real workhorse, able to operate in a variety of configurations and perform many different jobs. In 1955, the H-21 was adapted for testing in quite a new role.
And because of its size, weight, and capacity of about 13,000 pounds gross weight, it was used as the test bed to mount the machine guns down at Fort Rucker. And I was there when they were mounting a 50 caliber machine gun on the front landing gear because it was expeditious to do that.
This H-21 bristled with guns in almost every possible location. The workhorse became the first helicopter to go into service with 50 caliber machine guns when the French used them as gun platforms in Algeria. But its major war service took place in Vietnam in the early years of American non-combat support to the South Vietnamese Army from 1961 to 1963. When the Piasecki H-16 made its first flight on October 23, 1953, it was the largest helicopter in the world. Its rotor diameter was 82 feet, almost twice that of the H-21 workhorse. Powering this monster was a design challenge.
It was originally with two piston engines, one at each end of the aircraft, in their own engine rooms. It was quite interesting how everybody was enhanced by the fact that here was a helicopter that had an engine room.
The huge overlapping rotors were made of aluminum skin with a honeycomb composite filling. The H-16's fuselage had the capacity of a 4-engine airliner and could lift up to 14,000 pounds.
We later on, in the second model, went to turbines, and we had two turbines driving the machine. It was very successful and had 82-foot diameter rotors, but the RPM was so slow that any vibratory motion from the rotors, which were 3-bladed, would come in almost as a loping action. And you could actually almost see the rotor blades turning. You could actually watch the blade as it turned around.
The turbine engines chosen for the YH-16A were Allison T-38 turboshafts, each delivering 1,800 horsepower. The helicopter in this turbine-powered form first flew in 1955. In this form, the YH-16A was known as the Turbo Transporter. In 1955, Frank Piasecki left the company. It was renamed VTOL. Piasecki formed a new company, the Piasecki Aircraft Corporation. In early 1956, the YH-16A set an unofficial world speed record of 166 miles an hour. But shortly after, a test equipment failure caused it to crash, and hopes for a promising future were destroyed.
We said, okay, let's not do anything with the tandem because that's been fairly well established, and so let's not fight against ourselves.
Having left the big tandem helicopter behind, Piasecki turned his attention to exploring designs for radical forms of rotorcraft. This is the prototype of the Flying Jeep Skycar, or Air Jeep. It was the winner of an Army competition for a vehicle that was invisible to radar because of its ability to follow the contours of the Earth and remain under the radar signal. It made its first flight in September 1958 with Frank Piasecki at the controls. Lift, propulsion, and control all came from the ducted rotors. The pitch of each one could be changed independently, so the front or the rear could be lifted. A combination of cyclic pitch and vanes on the rotors gave directional control. The test program examined its potential as a stealthy weapons carrying system.
The Jeep was designed to fly under the trees, just feet off the ground, and under the foliage.
The next stage was a turbine-powered version with the rotors mounted on an angle, but the project was shelved in the early 60s. By 1960, Piasecki's old company had been taken over by Boeing and became Boeing VTOL. It was heavily involved in the development of a new medium-lift tandem helicopter for the United States Army. That helicopter was designated CH-47, but it would become known worldwide as the Chinook. It couldn't have come at a better time. America was already involved in Vietnam, and the Piasecki H-21 stationed there were showing their age. When the Chinook arrived in Vietnam in 1965, it had a huge and immediate impact. Over 25 years later, new Chinooks are still being produced. 1962. At the Piasecki Aircraft Corporation, another of Frank Piasecki's innovative ideas was being tested. He'd been working on the design of a ducted fan, which could be fitted to the rear of a small single-rotor helicopter. The idea was to increase its speed in level flight. The testbed was the 16H-1 Pathfinder, Piasecki's first single main-rotor helicopter since the early PV-2. The fan system wasn't only used for forward speed. The helicopter's foot pedals operated vanes in the ringtail, as the fan was called, to counteract torque and give directional control. The next test bed was the 16H-1A Pathfinder II. Modifications had been sponsored by the Army and Navy, and its goal was speeds up to 230 miles an hour. It was a compound helicopter with a small wing to take the load off the rotor in forward flight. In tests, it showed off its extreme maneuverability. The Pathfinder II almost succeeded in reaching its speed target in level flight. It flew at 225 miles an hour. While the Pathfinder never went into production, the idea of the ringtail ducted fan system is still well and truly alive, and is currently being tested for use on a high-speed attack helicopter for the future. Frank Piasecki has been involved with helicopters for more than 50 years. His legacy of innovation has a continuing effect on the helicopter industry.
That's okay.
Thank you, John. We have a coffee break in 9 minutes. Which one of you guys has got a 9-minute presentation. Huh? You do, Tony? 5 minutes. Yes, just 5 minutes? All right. We'll let Jean Belay came all the way from France. I think maybe most of you know his test pilot experiences and his historical writings. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Ray. The first post-war French helicopter was built in 1947. It was called the SE 3101, SE for Southeast Aeronautical Society. It was a small single engine equipped with a 100 horsepower engine. It had 2 tail rotors, like an inverted V at the end of transmissions going through the 2 stabilizers. The main rotor had been recovered from the side-by-side twin-rotor Focke-Algelis helicopter. We took that turning in the same direction as compared with American helicopters, at the opposite direction as compared with American helicopters, a habit we have kept on French helicopters. Longitudinal control was achieved through the vertical component of the thrust of the tail rotors. By a differential piston variation, one could change the vertical component without changing the horizontal one. A rather unpleasant configuration because in case of tail rotor shaft failure, not only do you lose yaw control, which already makes the pilot task uneasy, but you also lose longitudinal control, which makes it hopeless. Furthermore, there was a waste of power since part of the power was used to create 2 vertical opposite components. Actually, it was marginal in power when the pilot in charge, Stackenberg, after months of tethered test, tried to take off. The 3 wheels remained stuck to the ground. I was the second pilot, young and thin. I tried and succeeded in hovering 1 foot off the ground. This was in June 1948. The picture was taken a few weeks after we improved the rotor blades. There was another drawback with this configuration, a sudden change in the vertical thrust of the tail rotor when going into forward speed because of the downflow of the main rotor interfering with the tail rotor blades. During my first forward flight, at an airspeed of about 20 knots, I experienced a sudden pitch up of the fuselage with pointed toward the sky, despite a full forward stick. All I could do was to maintain the heading while the helicopter was going down and backward. Fortunately, at the very last moment, the tail rotor going out of the main rotor flow recovered their thrust, which prevented the tail of the aircraft from hitting the ground. I landed with quite a good backward speed without damaging anything. Tu mets la deuxième photo. I avoided the crash that time, but there was another chance for the helicopter. In September 1948, I could make a public demonstration at Villacoublay, an airfield near Paris. Tu mets la troisième. A few months later, on the eve of the 1949 Paris Air Show, opening day, I had to perform an authorization landing to obtain the authorization to demonstrate the helicopter at the show. I had never done an authorization landing before. In those days, instructors were afraid of them and did not teach them. And flying the 3101 was somewhat tricky. There was no twist grip for controlling pitch and throttle, but two different handles. The clutch was not centrifugal but hydraulic, with a separate handle for clutching and clutching. It made three handles for one left hand. Furthermore, the pitch was not balanced. When I loosened the collective pitch handle in order to declutch and make the auto-rotation landing, the pitch increased by itself, causing a drop in RPM. I quickly pushed back the pitch handle, but decreasing the pitch led to a high rate of descent as I was on final approach. I could not avoid a hard landing. As there was no damper on the landing gear, one of the main wheels broke and the helicopter rolled over. But it was repaired within 10 days, and I could demonstrate it on the very last day of the show in May 1949. Then I flew for another 2 flight hours, extended over several months, and the engine broke down. As there were no spare engine, the helicopter was sent to the Air Museum. Suivante. The following helicopter was the Alouette 1, tested in 1952-1953. Only 2 of them were built. We could not find a market for this helicopter. And at last, the Alouette 2, our first successful helicopter, flew in 1955. It was the start of our expansion. I thank you for your attention.
One thing that Jean did not tell you is that he set the altitude record for helicopters at 43,000 feet, as I remembered. It still stands. And he had a flame out, so he set another record for auto rotation from 43,000 feet. All right, the timing is very good. Let's take at least 20 minutes for a coffee break, and we'll come back, and we may be able to actually finish this by 5 o'clock. We're making